You kicked my wife out? Bad move. His voice cut through the marble silence of the restaurant like a blade. Just moments ago, a stunning black professor had been quietly erased from the guest list. But now her husband, a white billionaire in a limited edition Tesla, was standing at the door, and everything was about to change. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. We'd love to know. Do you think this was just a misunderstanding or something far more deliberate? In today's gripping true-to-life story, hidden bias meets unstoppable grace, and what begins as quiet humiliation ends in public reckoning. Make sure to stick around until the end, because the final moment will leave you breathless. And hey, if stories of dignity, justice, and power move like this, speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives. Hit the bell icon and share in the comments. Where are you tuning in from today? The sun hadn't yet begun to dip, but it already cast a golden glow over the polished pavement outside Mezon Lumiere, the city's most exclusive restaurant. The valet line gleamed with high-gloss Teslas, vintage Bentleys, and the type of European cars that didn't list prices, only waiting lists. Between them, a single black Uber SUV rolled to a stop, its windows tinted, its presence understated. From the back seat emerged a woman, a vision of poise and deliberate elegance. Aaliyah Monroe stepped out, her yellow silk dress catching the late afternoon light like a flame wrapped in satin. Her back was straight, her chin high, and her gaze calm. She wore no heavy makeup, no designer logos screamed from her accessories, and yet she drew stares, not because of her spectacle, but because of how she made silence look like power. Her hair was swept into a tight, high bun, not a strand out of place, and her heels clicked softly against the cobblestone as she moved toward the entrance. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere was already curated to perfection. Soft jazz spilled from hidden speakers, the scent of truffle oil mingled with hints of aged wine, and conversations floated above candlelight in practiced laughter. It wasn't just dining, it was a performance, and every patron knew their part. The hostesses, young and porcelain-faced, scanned the room like security cameras trained not on threat, but on aesthetic consistency. Aaliyah walked past them with the air of someone who belonged everywhere, yet expected to be questioned. She wasn't early by accident. Her husband Richard, a high-stakes investor and strategic mind behind half the properties in the zip code, would be arriving later. But she came on her terms to claim the space that had already been promised to her. As she approached the front desk, she offered a soft smile, one that barely curved her lips but carried more grace than an entire room of curated charm. "Good afternoon. There's a birthday party for Mason Langley. My husband confirmed our reservation. Aaliyah Monroe, table 9 by the window." She said it evenly, without apology, and waited. The hostess, a blonde woman in a tailored blazer with a name tag that read Chloe, paused, her expression flickering ever so slightly as she scanned the leather-bound reservation book. Her eyes dropped, rose, then dropped again. "I'm sorry, I don't see that name here," she said, her voice neutral, too neutral. Aaliyah didn't flinch. "It should be there. Richard Whitmore confirmed it with the Langley family. He reserved table 9 for us, window view." There was no irritation in her tone, only precision. Chloe's eyes flicked to a nearby colleague, and without another word, she whispered something behind the podium. Aaliyah stood still, shoulders squared, while behind her the symphony of luxury carried on. No one noticed her anymore, or pretended not to. Guests were being greeted with handshakes and champagne, ushered in with familiar nods and small bows. A couple breezed in with a toddler in tow, followed by 2 women comparing Dior heels. One of them looked Aaliyah over with a flicker of curiosity, then looked away just as fast. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No update, no eye contact, just silence. It wasn't the silence that bothered her. It was the choreography of it, the way it excluded so cleanly, so efficiently, without needing to raise its voice. Finally, Chloe looked up and gestured for her to come over. "We've had a last-minute request for table 9, she said smoothly. "One of our regular guests, Mrs. Cavendish, has arrived. Would you mind sitting at a table near the service entrance instead? It's quieter." Aaliyah inhaled slowly, Her fingers curled gently around the strap of her clutch. "That table was reserved in my name," she said. Chloe didn't blink. "I understand, but regular guests have standing preferences. It's nothing personal." But it always was, Aaliyah thought. It always had been. She considered leaving. She did. But something anchored her to that marble floor. Maybe it was dignity. Maybe it was exhaustion. She had spent a lifetime preparing herself for rooms like this, only to be dismissed within seconds of arrival. And yet, she wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. Not without her husband here. Richard was many things. A venture capitalist, a strategist, a man who could read market trends like palm lines. But more than anything, he was her amplifier. He didn't speak for her. He made sure the room heard her when she did. Still, she hated needing him in this moment, hated how quickly a simple dinner became a question of permission rather than confirmation. Behind her, another gust of laughter. The party had already started without her. She saw the Langley boy, in a bow tie too large for his neck, being handed a silver-plated cupcake stand. Around him, adults cooed and clicked glasses. Aaliyah was invisible to them, which was ironic. She had edited the thesis of one of those guests last year. She recognized his voice, but he didn't recognize her without the podium and title. She looked down at her phone. One message from Richard. Running 10 minutes behind. Almost there. That was all she needed to stay rooted. 10 minutes, she told herself. She could survive 10 more minutes of being erased. The sun outside had begun to lower now, light pouring in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating only one side of the room. On the other side, where the service entrance was located, the shadows had started to stretch, long and unwelcoming. Chloe offered another tight smile, as if she'd done her job admirably. Aaliyah didn't return it. She stood still, regal in stillness, every inch of her refusing to shrink. Her reservation was real. Her name was real. And soon the man behind that reservation would walk through those doors. And when he did, the illusion of exclusion that this restaurant relied on would collapse beneath the weight of reality. And they weren't ready for it. But she was. The reservation book was the kind of artifact that looked designed to intimidate. Leather-bound, gold embossed, and handled only by those trained to turn its pages like scripture. Behind the podium, Chloe's fingers moved with deliberate slowness, each flip of the page theatrical, like she was performing due diligence rather than simply stalling. Aaliyah stood unmoving, her breath even, her eyes locked on the hostess with the steady patience of someone who had long ago learned to recognize a performance when she saw one. Chloe's lips were tight, not with worry, but with calculation. After a pause, she looked up again and repeated herself with just the right amount of detachment. "As I said, I don't see a reservation under Monroe." Aaliyah didn't blink. She knew this game, and more than that, she knew the quiet violence of being told you were not on the list. Her voice came out calm but certain. It was confirmed by Richard Whitmore, directly with the Langley family. Table 9 by the garden window. It should be right there. Chloe offered a practiced nod that didn't touch her eyes. "Let me check with my manager," she said, already turning to whisper something to another staff member, without waiting for Aaliyah's response. It wasn't a conversation. It was a dismissal dressed as protocol. And just like that, Aaliyah was left standing alone while the curated theater of wealth carried on around her. Behind her, the party swelled. Champagne flutes clinked, children laughed in carefully measured bursts, and the staff floated by like trained dancers with trays of foie gras and sparkling water. No one looked in her direction, or if they did, it was the kind of glance reserved for someone who had wandered in by mistake. A woman in a crimson sheath dress and sky-high Louboutin breezed past the hostess stand and was immediately greeted by name, her coat taken before she finished her first syllable. A man in a linen suit gave a single nod and was whisked toward a private alcove as if royalty had arrived. The choreography was seamless, for everyone but her. It took 10 more minutes before someone returned to address her. The man introduced himself as Gareth, the floor manager. He was in his 40s, with a suit tailored to convey quiet authority and hair slicked back so tightly it looked like armor. His smile was courteous, but his eyes were less so. They lingered on Aaliyah just long enough to suggest skepticism without tipping into rudeness. I understand there's been some confusion, he said. Unfortunately, we don't have a reservation under your name or Mr. Whitmore's. He didn't offer to investigate further. Instead, he gestured toward a small table near the back of the room, tucked beside a frosted glass service door and partly obscured by a decorative column. We can seat you there, Gareth said, as if offering a favor. It's quieter, more private. The implication wasn't lost on her. She was being pushed out of the view line, not just from the garden window, but from the center of presence. Her seat, the one Richard had reserved weeks ago, was not merely misplaced. It had been reassigned, rewritten, erased, and in its place she was being offered exile by candlelight. Her back straightened imperceptibly, not in anger, but in quiet resolve. You're offering me a seat by the kitchen, she said, her tone still even, while someone else sits at the table that was reserved in my name. Gareth's smile faltered only slightly, but his voice remained neutral. We do our best to accommodate all our guests, ma'am. Sometimes mix-ups happen. That word again, mix-up, the most elegant lie in hospitality. It let prejudice wear a polished face and speak in polished tones. But Aaliyah wasn't fooled. She had taught classes on structural inequity, could quote court cases by memory, and had seen this scene play out too many times in too many forms to believe in coincidence. She looked past Gareth, toward the table she knew was hers. It was perfectly positioned beside the cascading glass wall, where wisteria vines curled like artistry and the evening sun filtered through like gold. It sat empty now, but not for long. A stir at the entrance drew her attention, and in walked a woman she recognized immediately, Veronica Cavendish, the queen of calculated opulence, a fixture in city galas and fundraisers, and one of those women whose smile was all performance and whose gaze was all judgment. Veronica moved with the confidence of someone who assumed the world was always hers to enter, and the hostess practically straightened like a guard at attention. Miss Cavendish, Chloe said, her voice suddenly brighter. Welcome back. Your table is ready. Table 9, as always. And just like that, it clicked. The reservation hadn't been lost. It had been replaced, silently, strategically. Veronica walked past Aaliyah without so much as a glance, her perfume trailing like a banner of conquest. She reached table 9, dropped her handbag onto the seat, and crossed her legs as if claiming her throne. Aaliyah's breath caught, but she forced herself not to react. Excuse me, she said quietly, turning back to Chloe and Gareth. That's the table my husband reserved for me. Chloe's lips parted in a feigned expression of surprise, while Gareth stepped forward with a tone that aimed for appeasement, but landed squarely in patronization. Miss Cavendish is a long-time regular. That table has been standing for her for weeks. Your husband's request must have been noted incorrectly. There it was, the final layer of erasure, not just denial, but inversion. Her reservation was not only invalid, it had never mattered. She felt the burn of heat behind her ribs, not rage but restraint, the kind that hardens instead of explodes. She wasn't here as a guest anymore. She was now a test case for how much erasure a woman can endure before the room notices. But the room didn't. It sipped, it gossiped, it laughed, and she remained invisible by design. She glanced at her phone again. No reply yet. Just her last message to Richard, still unanswered. She stood straighter and turned her gaze toward the front entrance, willing him to arrive, not just to claim her seat, but to witness the moment that would soon demand a reckoning. Because what they didn't know was that they had just erased the name of a woman who wasn't only expected, she was essential. Aaliyah didn't move. Her heels remained planted on the polished marble, her yellow silk dress still catching the filtered light like liquid gold. Yet every breath she drew now tasted metallic. Across the room, Veronica Cavendish was reclining into what should have been her chair, already accepting a chilled glass of champagne from a waiter who had no idea he was serving entitlement on a stolen throne. Veronica was all confidence and couture, her emerald green wrap dress clinging in just the right places, her platinum hair swept back with clinical precision, and her smile curated like an ad campaign. If she noticed Aaliyah, she made no sign of it. But Aaliyah knew she had. Women like Veronica were experts at pretending not to see what they had already assessed and dismissed. Gareth hovered at the podium now, pretending to reorganize the reservation log, though his eyes kept darting toward Aaliyah like he expected her to vanish if ignored long enough. Chloe busied herself with a tablet, tapping through digital screens with the urgency of someone desperate to look important. Neither of them spoke. No one did. It was as though the moment was too uncomfortable to acknowledge, so they defaulted to the one trick that had always worked: pretend she didn't exist. But Aaliyah existed, and she wasn't going anywhere. Not this time. She turned slowly, letting her gaze settle once again on table 9. Veronica had crossed one leg over the other and was laughing now, too loudly, at something the maitre d' had just whispered to her. The table sat in its spotlight of natural light, the bouquet at its center pristine, the crystal glasses gleaming like trophies. It was more than a table, it was a stage, and Aaliyah had been cast out of the scene before she'd even walked on. And yet the invitation had her name on it. The reservation had her name on it. Her husband had secured it personally. The only thing missing now was the truth on display, and the man who would not let it pass unnoticed. A small child darted past her, trailing a balloon shaped like a giraffe, followed by a woman in designer flats who gave Aaliyah a quick, polite smile before veering off toward the main event. The Langley birthday party was in full swing, parents chatting over champagne, children diving into artisan cupcakes, and the staff gliding between tables like practiced ghosts. No one noticed the tension rooted near the entrance, but Aaliyah felt it thickening in her throat, her ribs, her spine. The party wasn't just ignoring her, they were absorbing her absence as if it were intentional, as if it made the room more aesthetically balanced. She adjusted her clutch, not because it needed adjustment, but because it gave her fingers something to do other than curl into fists. The soft hum of a string quartet filtered in from the side room, the notes as elegant and impersonal as the art on the walls. And yet within the orchestration of wealth and exclusivity, something essential was unraveling. A place had been promised, a seat had been taken, a name had been erased, and somewhere, just beyond the valet circle, that promise was about to arrive. A waiter passed by her with a tray of crystal flutes, and as she turned to avoid him, Aaliyah heard the unmistakable sound of Veronica's voice cutting through the ambient murmur. "I mean, who reserves that table? I've been sitting there for years," she said, her tone dripping with performative amusement. "Some people just show up assuming the world owes them a window seat." A burst of laughter followed, tight, rehearsed, complicit. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She knew that tone too well. It was the sound of someone protecting a throne they never earned, but always expected to occupy. Chloe glanced over, possibly having heard, but offered no apology, no correction. Instead, she turned back to her screen, adjusting a non-existent detail. Gareth muttered something to a busboy, then quickly walked away as if proximity to discomfort might stain his jacket. Aaliyah was still alone. Not physically, there were people all around, but spiritually. She had been isolated the moment her name had been questioned, the moment her reservation had become a mix-up, the moment Veronica had claimed her place without hesitation, without question, without shame. Then came the shift, a faint sound, barely audible at first but distinct. Outside the front doors, a low hum grew louder, a sound too clean to be combustion, too smooth to be mistaken. Heads began to turn. The valet looked up sharply. Chloe straightened. And Aaliyah, still standing near the edge of the hostess stand, felt something inside her rise. Not hope exactly, but gravity pulling in her favor. The doors opened. But this chapter, this confrontation, hadn't reached its climax just yet. Not until every lie dressed as protocol was peeled back under the weight of truth. Not until the man who made the reservation, the man whose name held power in the contract ink in the real estate deeds behind these walls, walked through that door. Not with anger, not with noise, but with the kind of presence that didn't demand attention. It became the room. And so Aaliyah waited, spine unbent, heart steady. The chair may have been stolen, the name erased, the space denied. But the reckoning hadn't yet begun. It was simply approaching, one step at a time. The hush that followed was not silence, but anticipation. an instinctive pause that moved through the restaurant like the intake of breath before a storm. Conversations dulled, forks hovered midair, and even the string quartet seemed to falter for a note before resuming with studied calm. Outside, the limited edition Obsidian Tesla pulled to a perfect stop before the front steps, its matte finish catching the light with the low, predatory gleam of something custom-built to go unnoticed only by choice. The valet blinked, stepping forward too late, clipboard limp at his side, as the driver's door lifted and a single polished shoe met the stone beneath it. Richard Whitmore stepped out, not rushed, not dramatic, but purposeful. His charcoal gray suit was cut with the kind of precision that whispered bespoke tailoring, his shirt collar crisp beneath a silk tie the color of midnight. There were no designer logos, no loud watches, no overstated flair. Only the quiet command of a man who never had to raise his voice to be heard. He straightened his cuffs with a single motion, then locked the car with a tap. His eyes never left the building. He was already reading the space like a negotiation table, already weighing variables before the first word had been spoken. Inside, Chloe froze. Her fingers hovered above her tablet as if someone had switched off her programming mid-keystroke. Gareth, returning from the bar with a forced grin meant for another table, stopped in his tracks the moment he caught sight of the man walking through the glass doors. He didn't know who he was. Not really, but something in the way Richard moved told him this was not a man to be underestimated. And then he saw Aaliyah, still standing, still unseated, her expression unchanged, but sharpened now by the context of who had come for her. Richard's gaze found her instantly. The crowd, the chandeliers, the curated opulence. They all fell away. It was just her. He didn't rush. He didn't call out. He crossed the room with deliberate, even steps, his eyes never leaving hers. The marble floors didn't make a sound beneath his stride, but the weight of his arrival shifted everything. He reached her in seconds, but the silence he carried with him had already arrived before him, sweeping across the floor like a change in air pressure. "You've been standing here this whole time?" he asked, his voice low, restrained, but lined with something cold and final. Aaliyah didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth hovered between them like fog, palpable, undeniable, and thick with insult. She tilted her head toward the hostess stand. Richard turned, slowly, deliberately, like a man preparing to dismantle something carefully constructed and deeply flawed. Gareth tried to compose himself, smoothing the front of his suit as he stepped forward. "Good evening, sir. How may I assist you?" he began. But Richard didn't look at him. Not yet. His attention swept across the room, taking in every watchful eye, every frozen gesture. Only when his gaze landed squarely on Gareth did he speak. "You gave away the table my wife reserved." The words weren't loud, but they had gravity. They landed with the weight of consequence. Gareth's smile returned too quickly, like a reflex untrained for confrontation. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding, Mr. Whitmore," Richard said flatly. "Richard Whitmore." The name hit harder than the tone. Gareth's eyes flickered, his mind scrambling. That name meant something. It meant money, it meant ownership, and it meant he had made a very expensive mistake. We didn't realize she was your wife," Gareth stammered. "This guest, Miss Cavendish, is a long-standing client, and there was a last-minute change." Richard's voice cut in, smooth but sharp. "So tell me, if she hadn't been my wife, would her reservation have magically reappeared? Or would she still be standing here, invisible in a room she helped fund?" His tone never rose, but the blood drained from Gareth's face all the same. Around them, guests tried to pretend they weren't listening. Champagne was sipped without tasting, and bites were chewed without swallowing. The show had paused, and no one dared break the scene. Aaliyah stood still beside him, her eyes trained on the same man who had offered her a seat near the kitchen. But now she wasn't the woman waiting to be acknowledged. She was the mirror reflecting the failure of their curated civility. Richard turned to face Chloe, who had backed a step behind the podium. "Let me see the reservation log," he said. Chloe hesitated. "Our system doesn't allow." "Show me," he repeated, this time without a single change in tone, but with the unmistakable cadence of a man who was used to being obeyed. She fumbled with the tablet and turned it reluctantly. Richard's eyes scanned the screen, and when he found what he was looking for, he tapped once. Aaliyah Monroe. Table 9. Confirmed. Time stamped. Replaced at 2:48 p.m. with Veronica Cavendish. He didn't raise the tablet. He didn't need to. The room knew what he had found. And Gareth, watching his credibility drain in real time, opened his mouth only to close it again. You didn't just misplace a reservation, Richard said finally. You erased a person. He looked around again, not at the staff, but at the patrons. People who now realized the illusion of impartial luxury was cracked, and they were standing in the fracture. This is why I stay in the background, he continued, to see how this place operates when it thinks it's only serving the right kind of people. And with that, he turned back to his wife. Come with me, he said, not out of command, but restoration. They walked together, past Chloe, past Gareth, past the table that had been stolen. Richard didn't need to ask Veronica to move. The gravity of truth had already begun to shift, and in a room built to exclude quietly, the sound of presence was now deafening. Veronica Cavendish didn't rise immediately. She sat there at table 9, legs crossed elegantly, one manicured hand swirling her glass of rosé as if the chill in the air had nothing to do with her. Her emerald dress shimmered under the soft lighting, her expression fixed in a mask of polite confusion, but the twitch in her jaw betrayed her. She hadn't expected to be challenged. Not here, not in a room that had always favored her. The murmurs around her had changed too. They were no longer whispers of admiration or envy. They were sharpened by discomfort, by curiosity, by the dawning realization that something was very, very wrong. Richard and Aaliyah stopped just short of the table. He hadn't pulled her forward like a knight storming into battle. Instead, he had walked beside her, arms steady at her back, their pace synchronized like a silent march. When they reached the table, Richard spoke first, not to the room, not to Gareth, but directly to Veronica. You're in the wrong seat, he said, his voice steady as stone, offering neither accusation nor apology, only fact. Veronica glanced up, her mouth twitching into something between a smirk and a shrug. Oh, I had no idea this table was such a point of contention. I assumed it was first come, first served, she replied, lifting her glass for a sip she didn't take. Before Richard could respond, Aaliyah's voice cut in, cool, crisp, and unshakably composed. It's only first come when someone like me walks in, she said. For you, it's always been reserved, even when it isn't. Her words struck like a bell. Clean, precise, loud in their restraint. The tables around them shifted uneasily, the facade of pleasant indulgence crumbling at its edges. A man near the bar turned fully in his seat. A couple at the window stilled their forks midair. This wasn't just awkward. It was exposure. Veronica set her glass down. She let out a breathy laugh, the kind that tried to float above tension, but landed like static. Well, she said, brushing the front of her dress with theatrical delicacy, I suppose we're all learning our place today, aren't we? But even she heard the irony in her words, and it clanged off the crystal like a dropped utensil. Richard didn't bother replying. He stepped to the side and pulled out the chair. Aaliyah sat without flinching, not in victory, but in reclamation. From across the room, Gareth approached, his smile twisted into something brittle and useless. Mr. Whitmore, he began, if I may. You may not, Richard said without looking up. Gareth hesitated, his voice dying in his throat as he retreated a step. The sound of glassware and silverware had resumed, but the rhythm was off. Waiters moved like ghosts, pretending not to notice what everyone else was watching, with aching intensity. Aaliyah's eyes scanned the room, not with defiance, but with the practiced awareness of a woman who had always known the difference between being seen and being watched. She had been excluded before, at conferences, at gallery openings, at faculty dinners hosted by donors who forgot which black professor they'd invited. But this was different. This was a room she had helped build through proximity, through investment, through her name being linked to a man who could fund a skyscraper with one phone call. And still, they had tried to shrink her to nothing. Richard remained standing behind her, arms folded, gaze fixed forward. His silence wasn't withdrawal, it was precision. When Gareth returned a moment later, flanked now by two security guards in black suits trying to appear invisible, Aaliyah didn't blink. "Mr. Whitmore," Gareth said again, "we've had a request to de-escalate the situation. Perhaps it would be best if we relocate Dr. Monroe to a more private—" "Let me stop you right there," Richard interrupted. "You're suggesting we move her because your guest is uncomfortable with her sitting at her own reserved table?" Gareth paused just long enough to betray his fear. "It's merely a courtesy suggestion, sir." Aaliyah stood now, not in protest, in clarity. Her voice when it came was soft, but it cracked through the air like the start of thunder. "So after denying my reservation, offering me a seat by the kitchen, handing my table to someone who came in after me, and watching her mock me in front of your guests, you think the solution is to remove me?" She glanced at the guards, then back at Gareth. "Do you want them to drag me out? Because I promise you I've survived worse than this velvet-lined performance of civility." One of the guards shifted, unsure of whose side he was meant to be on. Gareth paled. "Dr. Monroe, please understand—" "No," Richard said, stepping beside her again. "Now you understand. We're no longer speaking as investor and manager. We're speaking as two men on opposite sides of a lawsuit." The word hit the room like an alarm. Quiet gas rippled across tables. A fork clattered to the floor. Veronica had retreated to another table, her jaw tight, her shoulders stiff, her eyes locked on her untouched drink. Aaliyah drew a long breath, slow and controlled, her eyes shining not with tears but with recognition. She wasn't here to be angry. She was here to be seen. Richard rested a hand on her shoulder, not in comfort, but in solidarity, then turned back to Gareth. "You have 1 hour," he said. "Clear your schedule. We're calling an emergency board meeting, and don't even think about touching the reservation log. We already have a copy." With that, he pulled out his phone and tapped once. Somewhere beyond the chandeliers and imported linens, a system began to shift. Something old had cracked, and no curated smile in this building would be enough to patch it. They didn't just try to erase a name, they tried to erase a presence. And now they would answer for it. The murmurs hadn't stopped. Even as the maître d' tried to resume the rhythm of fine dining, even as waiters reappeared with trays of amuse-bouche and vintage Bordeaux, the room pulsed with something rawer than curiosity, fear. It wasn't the theatrical kind, the one reserved for scandal and gossip, but the slow creeping realization that something sacred to this space had just been punctured. Power had entered the room, not loud, not flamboyant, but surgical, and it was still cutting through every illusion the restaurant had built around its name. Gareth stood frozen near the floral column, one hand gripping the edge of a server's station as if that wood and marble might anchor him. He looked like a man who had been summoned from a dream of control, only to find himself cornered by his own decisions. The words "board meeting" echoed in his ears louder than the piano, now softly resuming from the lounge. A lawsuit was not just a threat, it was an alarm bell, and every eye in the restaurant now watched him like a scene unfolding on stage. Except this time he was not the director. He was the spectacle. Still, something inside him refused to surrender. He straightened his cuffs, adjusted his tie, and crossed the floor toward Richard and Aaliyah, whose table now sat like a monument in the center of the room. "Mr. Whitmore," he began again, quieter this time, tone laced with a desperate attempt at reason. "I believe we can find a middle ground here. This was clearly a misunderstanding, and escalating it further would serve no one, especially not the reputation of Maison Lumiere." Richard didn't even look up. "What you call reputation, I call a pattern," he replied. "And the difference between the two is how long it takes before someone finally holds you accountable." His voice didn't rise, but it spread, slow and inevitable like smoke. Aaliyah, seated beside him, remained composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture impossibly still. But her silence was not passive. It was precise. She knew that sometimes the most powerful statement a woman could make was to refuse to shrink. Gareth tried a different angle. "Please, Dr. Monroe," he said, shifting his focus as if softening his gaze might erase what had been done. "Our priority is ensuring all guests feel welcome. If you'd prefer a more private table while we sort this out, we're happy to accommodate." Aaliyah turned her head slowly, her eyes narrowing just enough to cut the room in half. "Private? she said, her voice low but crisp. You mean invisible? You want to move me again, after taking my seat, erasing my name, and letting another guest mock me in plain sight, because she's uncomfortable sitting in the same room as the woman she tried to displace. The sentence hit like a whip crack, and this time, even the staff flinched. One of the security guards looked to Gareth for a cue but received none. The illusion of hierarchy had faltered, and everyone in the building could feel it. Gareth opened his mouth to object, but Richard finally looked up. Let me make this very clear, he said, leaning slightly forward. You don't get to remove the problem by removing the person who exposes it. That's not de-escalation. That's complicity. The words didn't shake. They landed. And then, without warning, Richard rose from his chair. He pulled a folded envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket and dropped it lightly on the table. This is the official time-stamped reservation confirmation, he said. Not only was it confirmed in your system, it was overwritten. Your internal logs will show it was replaced at 2:48 p.m. today. And unless I'm mistaken, your hostesses don't have override access to VIP tables. Only managers do. Gareth's breath caught. The moment snapped around him like a trap. Chloe had returned to the stand, her face pale, her tablet clutched like a shield. Richard turned to her next. You want to verify that for me, Chloe? Can you show us which account made the override? Chloe's mouth opened, but the only thing that emerged was a soft wheeze of panic. She looked to Gareth, who now visibly recoiled. Aaliyah stood again. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and devastating. You see, she said, her voice threaded with clarity. What you tried to make look like a minor clerical error was a conscious choice, and not just once, not just today, but again and again. Because I promise you, I am not the first guest of color to be told their seat was a mix-up. I might just be the first with the means, the visibility, and the resolve to call it what it is. By now, the room had shifted its attention fully. Phones that once scrolled menus were now discreetly recording, though no one said it aloud. Patrons who once looked through her were now unable to look away. A woman at the bar whispered something to her date, who slowly nodded. The myth of Mezon Lumiere's exclusivity was unraveling, and at its center stood a woman in a yellow silk dress, no longer asking for space, simply holding it. Richard turned toward the corner of the room and gestured. Within seconds, his assistant, an efficient woman with sharp glasses and a dark leather portfolio, stepped forward. The IT department has already forwarded the logs, he said. We have screen captures of every edit, every timestamp, every override from the last 48 hours. I'd suggest you prepare your side of the story, because the board won't need much convincing. Gareth's voice, when it returned, was thin. You're going to destroy an entire brand over one incident? Richard smiled, not with joy, but with clarity. No. You did that the moment you treated my wife like an exception instead of the standard. I'm just making sure the damage is documented. And just like that, the balance of power, so carefully managed, so quietly policed, had shifted. Not with shouting, not with spectacles, but with presence, evidence, and a refusal to disappear. What had once been erasure had now become reckoning. And as Gareth stepped back, his hands trembling at his sides, everyone in the room understood something irrevocable. The old rules no longer applied. The boardroom at Maison Lumiere had always been a place of quiet privilege. A sleek, glass-paneled chamber tucked behind a corridor marked staff only, known only to those who mattered. It was rarely used, designed more for aesthetics than action, but tonight it pulsed with unease. The lights had been dimmed to a muted glow, casting reflections off the obsidian table that stretched through the room like a blade. High-backed leather chairs lined either side, occupied by men and women in tailored suits who shifted nervously. Tapping pens or adjusting watches they no longer trusted to distract them. Richard Whitmore sat at the head of the table, posture relaxed in the way only someone with absolute leverage could afford. In front of him was a closed laptop, a leather folder, and a glass of still water he hadn't touched. He didn't need to pace. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence had already rewritten the power dynamic in the room. The board members, accustomed to seeing him as a silent partner, now saw the man behind the curtain, and that man was not here to play diplomat. Across from him, Gareth Simmons entered last. His usual confidence had evaporated, leaving behind only the hollow bravado of someone who had realized too late that the rules had changed. He clutched a thin leather portfolio like a shield, though he hadn't dared open it. The seat to Richard's right remained conspicuously empty, a subtle insult, an intentional vacuum of welcome. Gareth paused for a beat, waiting for an invitation that never came, then shuffled to the farthest end of the table and lowered himself silently into a chair. Richard let the silence stretch, letting them all feel it, the tension, the imbalance, the reckoning they had allowed to ferment behind velvet curtains and curated menus. Finally, he spoke. This emergency session has been called under Clause 12 of the Operating Charter. Gross misconduct requiring executive review. His voice was calm, deliberate, and each word struck like a judicial hammer. You've all seen the incident report, but tonight we're not here to review the paper trail. We're here to confront the culture behind it. One of the older members, silver-haired and soft-spoken, leaned forward and steepled his fingers. Richard, we understand the optics were unfortunate, but is it necessary to escalate this to disciplinary action? Gareth has been with us from the beginning. He helped build the Lumiere experience. Richard tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then perhaps it's time we define exactly what that experience entails. Because what I witnessed tonight wasn't hospitality. It was hierarchy disguised as elegance. The words hung heavy. Another member, younger and visibly rattled, adjusted her glasses and pulled up something on her tablet. We've reviewed the override logs. The replacement of Dr. Monroe's reservation was confirmed. The system shows manual input from Gareth's manager ID. She hesitated. But proving intent is more complicated. It could be human error, miscommunication. Richard tapped a button on the touchpad in front of him, and the lights dimmed another degree. A screen lowered soundlessly behind him, and the projector flickered to life. Intent, he said, isn't always in words. It's in patterns. The screen illuminated a spreadsheet, color-coded and time-stamped, each line a digital confession. Over the past 6 months, there have been 17 instances where guests of color were marked as no-shows or reassigned without justification. In 12 of those, their reservations were replaced within 30 minutes of a white guest walk-in. In all 17 cases, the override came from Gareth Simmons's login credentials. The silence that followed was not just stunned, it was shamed. A woman on the far end of the table closed her eyes briefly. A man near the center leaned back in his chair, his lips pressed tight. Gareth sat motionless, eyes locked on the screen as if seeing it for the first time, though every row listed a story he had hoped would remain unspoken. With all due respect, he said finally, voice brittle, you're making assumptions. We deal with high-profile clients, VIPs, emergencies. You know how fast-paced this environment is. And yet the pattern only repeats itself with one group of guests, Richard said, voice still level, though now sharpened at the edges. Not once was a white guest pushed to the back. Not once was a donor's niece redirected to the kitchen. This isn't oversight. It's systemic. He turned to the board. And every time it went unchecked, it became policy. Gareth leaned forward now, grasping at the last thread of control. You sit in that chair and talk about ethics, but you've barely been involved in day-to-day operations. You're a name on a contract, Richard. You don't know what it takes to manage people, to run a place this elite. You hide behind investment papers and let the rest of us deal with real people. He stopped, breath heavy, color rising in his face. Richard stood slowly, not in anger, but in resolution. You're right, he said. I don't know how you justify elitism while deleting professors' names from reservation books, but I do understand leverage. He reached into his folder and pulled out a document, thick, stapled, and signed. This is your termination under breach of ethical standards, effective immediately. Your access is revoked. Legal counsel has already been notified. Gareth surged to his feet, voice shaking. You're going to throw away a decade of loyalty because of one dinner table? Richard's reply came without pause. No, I'm removing rot before it defines the structure. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm cleaning house. No one moved to defend Gareth. No one spoke up. His silence had once protected them all, but now it had betrayed them. He looked around, eyes darting for some unspoken alliance, but found only carefully averted gazes and the sound of his own breath thick in his throat. When he left the room, he didn't slam the door. He shut it softly, but it felt like the final note of a funeral march. Richard turned back to the board. This is not optional. From this moment on, we rebuild, not from polish, but from principle. We don't start with chandeliers. We start with accountability. One of the older board members finally nodded. Another followed. One by one, heads turned. Not away, but forward. Outside, the night continued. But within these glass walls, something had changed. Power had spoken, not in volume, but in evidence. And the silence that followed was not denial. It was an agreement. It was the sound of a foundation being reset. Maison Lumiere never truly slept. Even in the quiet hours, its walls hummed with memory of whispered deals, stolen glances, and unspoken judgments tucked beneath white linens and polished silverware. But tonight, the hum had changed. It was no longer the purr of exclusivity or the rehearsed elegance of old money. There was something new in the air, something taut with awareness, and it began to shift the moment a black SUV rolled to a smooth stop at the curb and the doors opened without fanfare. Aaliyah Monroe stepped out first. She wore ivory silk, the fabric catching the fading sunlight like moonlight trapped in motion. Her curls spilled over her shoulders in soft waves, and her makeup was minimal, just enough to enhance, never to mask. She wore no diamonds, no logos, no armor of status. She didn't need it. Her presence had evolved past presentation. It was now a declaration. Behind her, Richard followed, dressed in slate gray, every line of his suit refined and restrained. He didn't offer her his hand, not because he lacked chivalry, but because he understood she was no longer stepping into the space as someone needing protection. She was stepping in as someone reclaimed. Inside the restaurant, the shift was immediate. Conversations quieted by fractions, not out of fear, but from the ripple of recognition. There were no murmurs, no pointed fingers, just acknowledgement. Waitstaff straightened their spines, guests adjusted their posture, and all eyes, whether brave enough to meet theirs or not, followed their path. But this time, it wasn't surveillance. It was reverence. Because everyone remembered what had happened, and more importantly, what had refused to be silenced. Isaiah, the new director of guest relations, stood just beyond the hostess stand. Gone was the nervous, soft-spoken server who once asked if it was safe to speak. Now in a tailored black blazer with the Mezon Lumiere crest embroidered in gold, he was the first voice they heard. "Dr. Monroe," he said with quiet strength. "Mr. Whitmore, welcome back. Your table is ready." Aaliyah inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, a subtle gesture that carried centuries of grace and centuries of cost. They didn't rush. The walk through the main hall was ceremonial in its own right. Staff didn't overperform their greetings, nor did they retreat into shadows. Instead, they moved with the rhythm of a new standard: respect without spectacle, service without subservience. As Aaliyah and Richard passed by the familiar booths and tables, no one interrupted them with forced apologies or empty praise. They simply let them pass, because this wasn't about being welcomed back. It was about being restored. Table 9 sat waiting at the far end of the dining room, near the glass wall that overlooked the wisteria-covered courtyard. It was dressed in crisp linen, softly lit with a halo of candlelight, and adorned with a simple bouquet of white peonies. But it wasn't just a table anymore. It was a symbol, a scar turned into a signature, a stage reclaimed, a story remembered. As Isaiah pulled out her chair, Aaliyah sat slowly, deliberately, not with triumph, but with peace. Richard joined her a moment later, his expression calm, his body language protective without being possessive. Their server approached, young, new, visibly nervous, but determined. "It's an honor to serve you both tonight," she said, placing the menus down with care. "Chef Marcus has prepared a special menu inspired by women who lead without needing to raise their voices." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow at that, the corners of her mouth twitching with something soft and knowing. "That's quite a theme," she replied. "He said you'd understand," the server answered, blushing but proud. They did not speak of lawsuits, terminations, or headlines. They spoke of art, music, and the wine list. But beneath every word was the quiet echo of a room that had once tried to erase her, now struggling to redefine itself in her presence. People still looked, but they looked differently now. Not with disbelief, but with curiosity. Not with dismissal, but with recalibration. A couple at a nearby table nodded respectfully. A woman at the bar mouthed "thank you" across the distance. Not for drama, but for representation. The meal arrived in courses, each dish named after a woman of power. Hatshepsut, Wangari, Maya, and Coretta. Each plate told a story. Each bite a reminder. And as Aaliyah and Richard dined, the energy of the space shifted again. Not violently, not radically, but irrevocably. The restaurant was no longer a place of filtered belonging. It was now a case study in change. Not because it wanted to be, but because it had to be. Midway through dessert, Isaiah returned. This time, he carried a small black envelope, reverently held in both hands. "We thought this should belong to you," he said, placing it on the table. Aaliyah opened it with care. Inside was a framed printout of the original reservation confirmation, her name, the date, the time, and the table number. Below it, in delicate script, read, "History keeps receipts." She stared at it for a long moment. Then she smiled, quietly, steadily, as if finally exhaling something she had held for far too long. Richard lifted his glass. "To the table that tried to forget you." Aaliyah clinked hers gently against his. "To the memory that never let it." Around them, the low hum of jazz resumed. Forks danced, wine poured. But no one dared speak over the quiet weight of what had been returned. This was not a victory lap. This was a restoration of truth. And when they stood to leave, the entire staff subtly straightened. Not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Guests turned, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. And Aaliyah walked out through the same doors that had once marked her exclusion, her posture just as straight, her chin just as high. But now the wind at her back was warm. She didn't need a throne. She didn't need a microphone. She just needed what was always hers, her name, her space, her seat. And now no one in that room would ever forget it again. The story was never meant to leave the restaurant. That's how these things usually go. Buried beneath silk napkins, drowned in expensive wine, and dismissed by silence more polished than any PR statement. But this time, it didn't fade. Because someone had filmed, someone had shared. And by morning, Aaliyah Monroe's name wasn't just on a reservation. It was trending worldwide. The video didn't go viral because of a scandal, but because of recognition. People saw themselves in her poised refusal, in the way her voice didn't crack when they tried to push her aside, and in the quiet fury of a man who used power not to dominate, but to restore. The clip of Richard's words, "You don't get to remove the problem by removing the person who exposes it," spread like fire. Commentators dissected every frame. Celebrities reposted it with captions like, "This is what allyship looks like," and "Grace under fire." But it was Aaliyah who became the soul of the moment, not because she wanted to, but because she stood when so many would have chosen to sit quietly. Her face, composed, radiant, unyielding, appeared on magazine covers, podcasts, and panels. People didn't just want to know who she was. They wanted to know how she had stayed so calm. But she didn't give them rage. She didn't play the hero. She gave them context. In a 3-minute statement recorded in her study, bookshelves behind her, soft gold earrings glinting in the light, she spoke not about the dinner, but about what it represented. She talked about erasure dressed in courtesy, about the luxury of invisibility reserved for the dominant, and about how silence had never protected the silenced. She ended not with a call-out, but a challenge. "The next time you see someone being pushed aside," she said, "don't ask what they did to deserve it. Ask what you've done to allow it." And the world listened. Mezon Lumiere's leadership moved quickly because they had no choice. Within a week, the restaurant launched a full transparency initiative, releasing public reports on guest complaints, revising staff training programs, and appointing a new diversity director. But they didn't stop at housekeeping. The board authorized the rebranding of their flagship location. A new plaque was mounted beside the front entrance, a brushed brass rectangle bearing only 5 words: "Equity is the new luxury." Inside, a photographic installation had taken over the west wall of the dining room. It featured a series of portraits titled "Unapologetically Seated." Black women in high fashion, each captured in a moment of stillness and strength. Aaliyah's photo was last in the row. She sat in the same yellow silk dress, eyes steady, hands folded, a quiet defiance in her posture. Underneath a simple line: "She stayed, so others wouldn't have to stand alone." Other industries took notice. Hotels began reevaluating their guest profiling systems. A luxury fashion house that once overlooked representation reached out to Aaliyah to collaborate on a campaign about visibility. Investment firms started offering grants to Black-owned culinary businesses, citing Mezon Lumiere's reckoning as a wake-up call. Academic institutions, ones that had once sidelined professors like her to panels instead of podiums, invited her to keynote their equity summits. And still, Aaliyah refused to become the symbol they craved. She didn't sell the moment. She stewarded it. She declined most interviews, turning down TV networks and brand deals. Instead, she co-launched an initiative called the Reserve Project, a cross-industry watchdog group that audited how businesses handle reservations, service hierarchies, and guest prioritization. It didn't shame restaurants. It tracked them. It turned anecdote into data, and with each report, another curtain lifted. Meanwhile, Richard did what he always did. He built. But this time, it wasn't just profit that motivated him. He redirected a portion of his hospitality portfolio into funding anti-bias training and institutional restructuring. He partnered with architecture firms to redesign service spaces so no guest was ever seated near a kitchen by mistake again. He issued a public statement that was shared more than any financial forecast he had ever released. "Power is wasted when it's only used to protect itself," he wrote. "It should be used to correct what others have grown comfortable ignoring." The Langley family, whose child's birthday had unintentionally served as the backdrop to the revolution, sent a handwritten note to Aaliyah. In it, they apologized for their silence, admitted their complicity, and offered to fund scholarships under her name. Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. When she did, she said only, "Repair begins with listening. Let's start there." And still, amidst the noise, the headlines, the shifts, there was dinner. A few months later, Aaliyah and Richard returned to Maison Lumiere again. This time, they weren't announced. They didn't walk in dressed for war. They walked in like any couple on a quiet night out, laughing softly, fingers loosely intertwined. The table was waiting, as always, not because of fear or performance, but because systems had been changed, not rewritten overnight, but recalibrated through choice. Their server smiled. The staff moved with ease. The music was softer now, less like a performance, more like an atmosphere. And when Aaliyah sat, this time in deep red silk, with her hair loose over one shoulder, there was no weight on her shoulders, no eyes challenge her right to belong. Only the space she had already claimed, and the quiet acknowledgement that the revolution had begun, not with speeches, but with presence. Not every dinner changes the world, but some reveal the blueprint for how it could. And this one undeniably had. What did this story stir in you? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Thank you for taking the time to experience this journey with us, where silence was broken and presence became power. If this story moved you, inspired you, or challenged the way you see the world, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more narratives that matter. Hit the bell so you never miss an update, and let us know where you're listening from. We can't wait to connect with you again in the next episode.